there, and welcome to Restoration Messianic Fellowship and the counting of the Omer 2026. Let's start off with the blessing. It says, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzvanu al sefarat ha'omer. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and is commanding us concerning the counting of the Omer. So today is day 36, which is 5 weeks and 1 day of the Omer. Hayom Shisha Ushloshim Yom Shechem Shchamisha Shavuot. All right, I tried to record this one yesterday, but apparently the sound did not come through. So we're back on the statement of beliefs, and this one's one of the more controversial ones that we have because of how it talks about the type of people we are or who we are supposed to be, and whether or not we are to exist as we do today in our separate corners. So I'm going to mostly be reading statement number 9 from our beliefs, and it's a long one, so I'll try not to comment too much. It says, faith in Messiah Yeshua was never supposed to create a separate religion or organization distinct from the Jewish people and the kingdom of Israel. That's the controversial part. We're not supposed to go in a separate direction with a completely new identity or life or behavior. So there's not supposed to be an organization that is distinct or separate from the Jewish people and the kingdom of Israel. Jewish people who believe in Yeshua do not cease being Jewish, nor do they have to abandon their culture, upbringing, tradition, or history. Salvation is first to the Jew and also the Gentile. By faith in Messiah, Gentiles are included in this amazing work of God in fulfillment of the promise given to Abraham to bless the nations through him. Gentiles do not replace Israel or the Jewish people. Rather, Gentiles are added to the ongoing work of God. By faith in Messiah Yeshua and coming into the covenants by his work and ministry, by his work, Yeshua's work, Gentiles are made citizens of the commonwealth of Israel and are given a share in the promised inheritance. Of course, this is essential out of the book of Ephesians, and this is where the next statement goes. It says, Ephesians 2:12 states that Gentiles who were not a part of the commonwealth of Israel nor the covenants of promise are brought near by the blood of Messiah. Gentiles are added to what God has been building all along, so they are no longer strangers and foreigners, but they are fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household, which is why the practice of the faith should look more like the first century than it currently does. Okay, I'll back up a little bit. I want to read out of Ephesians chapter 2 before we get to that. Starting in verse 11, he says, Therefore keep in mind that once you Gentiles in the flesh were called uncircumcision by those called circumcision, which is performed on flesh by hand. Basically, he's saying, you were not one of us. You were not a part of us. You were the uncircumcised. You were of the nations. He says, at that time, so this is our condition as Gentiles. This is our status before God because of our disconnection from God. At that time, you were separate from Messiah, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. It's not that God didn't exist in the world, it's that he was no part of our lives because we did not have these things together with him. So we were separate from Messiah. Obviously, we had even no expectation of his coming. We were excluded from the commonwealth of Israel. That's the nation. That's the people that he was trying to make. The Israelites were able to incorporate and bring in outsiders, foreigners, sojourners. There was a method, there was a mechanism for getting them to be included in the commonwealth and to be welcomed in. You see things like that with Uriah. He was always known as the Hittite, but he was brought into faith into the people of God. You were separate from Messiah, you were excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and you were strangers to the covenants of promise. You had no place in the covenants. And notice that that word covenant is not singular, it is plural, covenants. So we had no place in any of the covenants. And the hope is that that is all about to change, because we need the hope that comes through Messiah. Because verse 13, says, but now in Messiah Yeshua. So once we have come to faith in Messiah, all the things that he just said in verse 12 are changed, are reversed. Our identity, our position before and with God have changed. But now in Messiah Yeshua, you who, where am I? You who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of the Messiah. So you were far off, now you are near. So whereas previously you were excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, now you're included by the work of Messiah. Once you were strangers to the covenants of promise, now in Messiah, you're no longer a stranger. And he goes into that. He's in verse 16, he's seeking to reconcile both Jew and Gentile in one body through the cross. In verse 17, he came and proclaimed shalom to you who were far away, that's us Gentiles, and shalom to those who were near. So even those who were already members of the covenant, the Commonwealth of Israel, even if you were already part of the covenant, you still needed the shalom spoken to, preached by, brought by the Prince of Peace. He says, for through him we both have access to the Father by the same Ruach, by the same Spirit. And this is where it kicks in. And we read these every week in our service. Verse 19, so we are brought near by the blood of Messiah, back in verse 13. Verse 19, so then you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but you are fellow citizens. Fellow citizens of what? Not a new organization, not something called the church. Now we are citizens, fellow citizens with God's people in the Commonwealth of Israel. And we've even been made members of God's household. That's that spirit of adoption. That's what John 1:15 talks about. It's those that who by faith are given the right to be called children of God. Verse 20 says, you have been built on the foundation made up of the emissaries and prophets, with Messiah Yeshua himself being the cornerstone. It is in him the whole building, being fitted together, is growing into a holy temple for the Lord, of living stones, of both Jew and Gentile. In him you also are being built together into God's dwelling place in the Ruach. So we as the strangers, we as those that were from the outside or from far away, are being brought near, brought into this existing people, into this existing nation, and he is adding us to it by declaration, by authority of the king. He is bringing us into the family. And so with that, it's not that now that we're here that the Jewish people have to change everything that they're doing to accommodate us. That's not the way it works. God's standards are not going to change for us. Instead, when we are brought near, when we are brought in, it is us Gentiles who have to make the greatest change from our old ways to the new way, the new walk of faith. And that's already been lived out by the people of God as they have received the Torah, as they have been seeking to live that out as this nation. So that's why the practice of the faith is not supposed to go in some radically different direction. It's not supposed to be something completely different. Instead, the practice of the faith should look more like what the first century was doing than it currently does, than what the apostles, what the first century believing community were willing to do. And if you notice in the book of Acts, Peter and the apostles and Paul were, as long as they were allowed, as long as they were able, they were going to the temple and participating in the daily times of prayer, which involved sacrifices. They were participating in the feast days. They were participating in all of those things. Even the Nazirite vow that Paul joined in on required a sacrifice. So they did not see an incompatibility between the ongoing ministry and worship in the temple and faith in Yeshua. Now, obviously, once the temple was destroyed as judgment for rejecting Messiah, not recognizing the time of his appearing, both unbelieving Jews and believing Jews had to change their way of life to a degree, their way and mode of worship. That's where the synagogue became even more significant and more important, so long as the temple was not there. But they did not throw it away or abandon it and say, well, it's now worthless, like we often say today. So our faith should look more like them than it does what we've done with it. The statement goes on, says Paul uses another analogy in Romans chapter 11 to describe how Gentiles have been brought into the redemptive plan of God. And he speaks of an olive tree, a symbol of the nation of Israel, its branches, and the idea of being grafted in. And I just want to remind everybody, even in spite of all of the majority of the Jewish people, the leadership rejecting Yeshua, not recognizing his appearing, Paul starts out with in chapter 11, I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? And he says, absolutely not. May it never be, under no circumstances. And that's where so many people seem to be saying that today, that because they did not recognize Yeshua's appearing, that means he is just throwing them away. He's done with them. And Paul is saying exactly the opposite. May it never be. Under no circumstances has he done that. So he describes this grafted in process in verse 17. He says, if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, and that's talking about us as the Gentiles, were grafted in among them and became a partaker of the root of the olive tree with its richness, with its nourishment, with its strength. Do not boast against the branches, but if you do boast, it is not you who support the root, but the root supports you. So in other words, Gentiles, you did not make this happen, and you're not keeping it happening, and it's not about you. You're being made a part of something already here. You will say then, in verse 19, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. True enough. They were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Notice then the kindness and severity of God, severity towards those who fell, but God's kindness toward you if you continue in his kindness. Otherwise you too will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of that which by nature is a wild olive tree, and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? So notice something about that then when it says grafted contrary to nature into the cultivated olive tree. Gentiles are being brought into something that we were not born into, and it's very different and foreign to us. It doesn't come naturally to us. It's like, man, I have no idea what I'm doing to live this way of life that the scriptures are calling me to now that I believe in Yeshua the Messiah. And we have just completely turned that around and said, I don't have to change anything about me. The statement goes on, and it says the olive tree is that symbol of the nation of Israel, and its branches are its people, and the idea of being grafted in. The question becomes, what does grafted in mean? It says the cultivated nature of the tree fits with several of Yeshua's parables, describing the amount of special time and attention the cultivated tree receives from the gardener. The one who has set the boundaries, made this protected place, made this protected people, and how he is investing special time and attention to them. It says the gardener expects the cultivated tree to produce fruit, and he frequently comes to inspect it. And if it's not producing fruit, he talks about him pruning the branches. It says the cultivated branches already connected to the tree are those already within the covenants of promise, right? Already citizens of the Commonwealth of Israel. So that's meaning from Israel. That's the Jewish people. Gentiles are called the wild olive branches, meaning from the nations. And Paul makes the point that the Gentile believers in Yeshua are not brought from the wild into a new garden, or he does not bring us to a different tree. Rather, the wild branches are added to a pre-existing garden, the one that he has already been building and has built, and already into a pre-existing tree. In other words, the gardener did not make a new or separate garden just for the wild branches that he's bringing in, nor did he graft them into a new tree. So again, we're not supposed to be separate. We're not supposed to be a new organization. There's not supposed to be something cut off from the nation of Israel, from the Jewish people called the church. That's not supposed to exist. It says, rather, the wild branches are grafted into an already existing tree. We are made citizens of the Commonwealth of Israel. We're no longer strangers and foreigners. We are adopted into the family of God. So the wild branches are grafted into an already existing tree alongside the believing cultivated branches. And these newly added branches take their nourishment, their strength, from the existing root, which has been supplying and feeding and strengthening the natural branches all along. So the source of their nourishment from the Torah, from the Word, from the covenants, the root is the heart of the promise. That is Messiah. He is the goal of the Torah. He is what everything is pointing to. But what flows through all of that and the promises and the covenants are that nourishment from the root. We don't necessarily see everything now, and yet we love him, as Peter talks about, because we are being strengthened by what the promises is. We don't have what we hope for, but we are we are rooted in the promise. Goes on, it says, once the wild branches are brought into the existing garden and grafted into the existing tree, the wild branch is to be considered just as cultivated as any other natural branch, just more recently. In the parable of the hired workers, those hired in the last hour are paid the same wage as those hired early in the day. The parable emphasizes the point that the master has the right to pay the same wage to all workers regardless of when they were hired. Again, that's going back to that idea of that the king, the Messiah, is bringing in these other workers from the nations and adding them to his people, to his nation. The king has the right to call in anybody if they will pledge their loyalty to him and agree to live by his ways. He's not asking for permission from the other knights to do that or from the other people to do that. The king does it by his own authority. And there's another connection to that goes all the way back to Jacob and Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which I'm not going to get into right now. But the master has the right to hire anybody he chooses. And he has the right to pay them the same wage, regardless of when they were hired. It goes on, it says, in the same way, the gardener does not ask for permission to gather the wild branches and bring them in. And the fruit of both branches, wild and natural, that are both drawing their nourishment and strength from the root and from that the sap of that, are considered as fruit of the one cultivated tree. Because together the wild and natural branches are echad. They are echad in the same way that husband and wife are supposed to be echad. That all the different pieces of the tabernacle, when it is joined together and built together, all those pieces are described as echad, as one. And it says this oneness pleases the gardener and is the heart of his prayer. That he is always intended. Paul emphasizes this very strongly, that he is making one new man out of the two. So from Jew and Gentile in Messiah, he is bringing us together as one. Not a new organization, but from the true heart of what he has been building all along, ever since the first call of Abraham, ever since the Exodus and the redemption from Egypt. That's the group, that's the organization he is making us a part of. The statement ends with the blessing Adonai promised to extend to the nations when he first called Abraham continues every time a Jew or a Gentile comes to faith in the Jewish Messiah. That's when we are truly being who he has called us to be, and that is what he is making us into. That is going to be our future under his rule and his reign in his kingdom. So with all of that, I know I could go on for a good while. I'm going to stop with that. May you be blessed. May you continue to be recognizing the counting of the Omer. Amen.